media lesson provides a review of the process of mapping an epistle text. We'll be walking through the 3-step process for tracing the argument of an epistle passage with the goal of better understanding the flow of thought being expressed. As a reminder, the 3 steps involve, first, dividing the text into its clauses, typically with 1 verb per line. Then, second, underlining conjunctions or other connecting words at the beginning of these separated clauses. Third, we'll use those conjunctions to determine the relationship between clauses, usually a clause's relationship with the preceding clause. And here we'll use the Logical Connections handout to identify what the conjunction is telling us about the relationship. We're going to use a passage from 1 Peter to practice on the process. 1 Peter 3, verses 13 through 16. Let's begin to identify the clauses of this passage verse by verse. The first question to ask in a verse is how many verbs? So how many verbs are in verse 13? If there are 2 verbs, we'll typically divide the verse into 2 clauses, 2 lines. If there are 3 verbs, 3 clauses, etc. Verse 13 of chapter 3 reads, "Who will harm you if you are eager to do good?" The verbs are will harm and are eager. So there are 2 clauses in this verse. Who will harm you and if you are eager for good. I put these on different lines with a space between so we can clearly see the clauses in their distinctions. It will be also helpful to number each clause for reference, so I've labeled these 13a and 13b. Now verse 14. It reads, "But even if you might suffer for your righteous behavior, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats and do not be frightened." First, we identify the verbs of verse 14. There are 4 of them: might suffer, are, or blessed, do not fear, and do not be frightened. 4 verbs, so likely 4 clauses. To determine where clauses break, it is often very helpful to pay attention to punctuation. This helps us in dividing clauses between 14a and b and also 14b and c. Now try your hand at verse 15. Take a moment to identify the verbs in verse 15. I'm going to give you a minute just to do that on your own. The verbs in this verse are set, apart or set, being ready, asks, and do. In other words, we have 4 verbs in this verse. Now we can divide this verse into 4 clauses initially, surrounding these 4 verbs. In this verse, we do have a relative clause. A relative clause is one that begins with who, whom, or which. Sometimes that can function in a relative clause as the relative pronoun. Relative clauses always provide an explanation for a word in the previous clause. So I typically advise keeping relative clauses with that previous clause. This will make our map just a bit shorter. And because the relative clause is always an explanation, we don't have to delineate it separately. So here we'll keep 15c and 15b together. 15c is the relative clause who asks you about the reason for your shared hope with the previous clause. So our adjusted clauses will look like this in verse 15. As we turn to the final verse, verse 16, be looking for another relative clause. The verse reads, "Keeping your conscience clear, so that those who speak maliciously about your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." If we identify the verbs, we will see 3 of them: keeping, speak, and put to shame. 3 verbs, so initially 3 clauses. As we try to divide the verse into 3 clauses, however, we run into an issue around this relative clause, 16c listed here. So here are my initial divisions. This is kind of a messy one. 16a, keeping your conscience clear, that works. 16b, so that those, and then 16c, who speak maliciously about your good behavior in Christ, 16d, may be put to shame. The relative clause comes in 16c, who speak maliciously, etc. The problem with isolating this relative clause from its surrounding words is that it splits another clause, which is 16b plus 16d, into 2. When the subject, those, 16b, is separated from its verb, may be put to shame. We don't want that to be the case. We want to keep those together. So since this relative clause, who speak maliciously, etc., tells us about the those of 16b, we just should keep it together with that clause and then keep the verb with it as well. Keep the main verb. Those may be put to shame. So really, in this case, because we're keeping the relative clause with what comes before, we're going to also then keep the verb that goes with that, those people. Keeping that all together, we're going to have something like this in the end. 16a, keeping your conscience clear. 16b, so that those who speak maliciously about your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. That's the process of separating the passage into its clauses, discrete clauses. Now that we've done this first step, your emerging map would look like this. Each clause on one line, other than those relative clauses, and a space between each, all of them numbered in their subdivisions. Now we turn to the second step, which is a bit easier. It involves underlining the conjunctions or other connecting words. Sometimes these are in English grammar called particles. Sometimes certain adverbs will function as a connecting word. And we look at these when they begin a clause. You don't need to highlight any other conjunctions that come in the middle of clauses or at the end of clauses. The point is to identify the conjunction or connecting word at the front. And we'll underline that, and then we will be able to use those underlined connecting words to help us identify relationships between clauses, which is the last step. It's really helpful at this point to have on hand the Logical Connections handout because this lists the most common connecting words that you'll see in any passage in the epistles. So I encourage you to start with that handout as you underline conjunctions on your map. So if we move through verses 13 through 16, we see a connecting word or conjunction in 13b, if. That shows up on your Logical Connections handout, and you can see it here as well. 14a has a connecting word, but, at the front. 14b does not. You are blessed. That's a subject of the sentence. There's no connecting word there. But hang on, we'll talk more about the connection between that line and the previous one in just a bit. 14c also does not have a connecting word at front. Do is a verb and not a connecting word conjunction. 14d and 15a, but. There is no connecting word at the beginning of 15b. Always is telling you more about the being ready idea. It's not telling you about a connection with 15a. 15c, the word yet is a connecting word, a conjunction. 16a, there are no connecting words there at the beginning. 16b, so that. That functions together, both of those words, so that. Usually giving a result or a purpose. So we've underlined the conjunctions at the beginning of lines, and the final step will involve the work of identifying the relationships between clauses. Even for clauses without a connecting word, we're going to listen for the implicit connection. Now we're going to do this work of identifying relationships between clauses line by line, just like we've been doing the rest of our work. And usually we are listening for how a line relates to the line before it. Although sometimes a conjunction will point forward, and we have an example of that we'll look at in this passage. So we begin with the second clause, 13b, and ask about its relationship to 13a. 13a is connected, as you might guess, to what's come before, verse 12 presumably. While that's a great thing to ask about in the wider scope of things, we're not going to pay attention to that here for this example. So 13a, who will harm you? 13b, if you are eager for good. Looking at the logical connections handout again, we see that if introduces a conditional clause, as in an if-then construction. If you do this, then you will do that. So we write conditional next to 13b at the far right of the line. This helps us to see that 13b is conditionally related to 13a. Who will harm you if you are eager for good? Let's take a look at the beginning of 14a. The but indicates a contrast, according to the handout. So you can put contrast on the right of that line. We saw already that 14b does not have a conjunction, but notice how it finishes the thought of 14a. Even if you might suffer for your righteous behavior, you are blessed. Also, you can note that even if of 14a tells us about the relationship between 14a and b, while the but pointed backwards. This is a case of a conjunction pointing forward. The even if points forward. So I'm going to go ahead and underline even if as a kind of second conjunction in 14a, with the but pointing backwards and the even if pointing forwards. Looking up even if on the handout, we see that it indicates a kind of concessive relationship. So we add concessive, but we're going to add it to 14a rather than 14b. A concession is a kind of qualification of the main clause. You are blessed even if you suffer unjustly. Because there are two conjunctions in 14a, it has two relationships identified. Again, one pointing backward and the other pointing forward. 14c and 14d are connected by and, which typically gives us an additional idea. It's a rather simple kind of connection. So we're going to put additional idea on that line. These two clauses are similar ideas to one another. To determine the relationship between 14b and c then, or the first half of the verse and the second half of the verse, we're going to need to listen to the implicit connection between the two. Let's listen as I read it and think about what you're hearing as we hear the connection come. But even if you might suffer for your righteous behavior, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats and do not be frightened. When I read that, I hear something like so between these two. You are blessed even if you suffer for your righteous behavior. So don't fear their threats. Don't be frightened. So I'm going to write an implication on line 14c. Implication or result fits that so language according to our handout. So listen for the implicit conjunction, if you will, implicit idea of connection. And by the way, you can try this out a few times. Do an initial map and then go back and check it and listen for the connections again. And I find it often very helpful to read the text out loud as I do that. We can walk through the rest of the passage line by line, asking about the relationships between each consecutive line. 15a begins with a but, which we've seen can introduce a contrast. I would want you to note on the handout there's another option for the word but, and that is part of a positive-negative combination of two or more lines. One is a restatement of the other, but one is in positive language, one in negative language. If 14c and d is the negative statement, do not fear, do not be frightened, then we can understand 15a as the positive restatement of this idea. In your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. This is a kind of don't do this, but instead do this. While 15b doesn't have a conjunction or connecting word, we can hear the always being ready as potentially a means, one possible means or way of setting apart Christ as Lord, or potentially as an additional idea to it. You notice I've marked it as means here. 15c begins with yet, which is a concessive conjunction. It's like the word however. 16a, without a conjunction, might be heard as a result of 15c. If they are ready to answer respectfully and gently, then they can have a clear conscience. They will remain above reproach even as they are maligned. 16b. 16b provides another result so that's clearly there, we've underlined it. It is the result of their clear conscience that people then will be put to shame who are speaking maliciously about them. So, I know I ran through those last few pretty quickly, but in the end, here's what our map would look like after completing all 3 steps. Notice that there is a line, identifying word on each line, except for the first one, which points us back to the previous context, and don't have to worry about that one. And also 14b, because as you recall, 13 or 14a had both a contrast going backward with one conjunction and a concessive going forward. This process is intended to help you see the flow of thought line by line and so better understand the argument being put forward. So to sum up, I want to talk about the argument briefly of this important passage in 1 Peter. In this particular passage, we can hear the author exhorting his audience to guard against living out their allegiance to Christ in a way that offends. They are to live out their allegiance to Christ instead gently, respectfully. All the while, they're to be ready to suffer for that allegiance if need be, and the righteousness, the allegiance and the righteousness it entails. If they do suffer, they don't need to fear those who speak against them because God's blessing rests upon them. 14b, you are blessed, even if you suffer. That's a sense of the passage, of this little bit of the argument of 1 Peter, and this mapping process will help you get a better sense of that argument and what the author is conveying in the particular passage we're looking at.